Free rein for the government over Brexit. Britain's political parties under threat from cyber attacks, and less than 3 years on, a call from Scotland's First Minister for a second independence referendum. Welcome to Tip TV Politics. On the programme this week, we hear from RUSI's Ewan Lawson on Britain's cybersecurity. We talk tomorrow's Netherlands election with Dina Pardijs of the European Council on Foreign Relations, Scottish independence with Caroline Lindsay of Liberal Democrat Voice, and to talk through the week's top news, Lib Dem peer Lord Taverne and Richard Angell, Director of Progress. Hello and welcome to Tip TV Politics with me, Rob Double. So for some it came as a shock, but for others it was possibly the most predictable political event so far this year. Last night, both the House of Commons and the House of Lords voted to give Theresa May the power to trigger Article 50 and officially begin the process of Britain leaving the European Union. But the key detail to note from last night is, remember all of those discussions we've had over the past few weeks about how Parliament should force the government to guarantee the rights of EU citizens in the UK, or the Parliament should have a meaningful vote on the negotiations outcome in 2019? Well, none of it is going to happen. No conditions, or amendments as they're called in Parliament, have been placed on the government when triggering Article 50. But if that wasn't enough news for you for one day, in comes Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland. Speaking after a meeting of her cabinet yesterday, she announced her intention to seek a second referendum on Scottish independence. We'll be covering both stories this week, but let's start first with the news about Article 50. Richard, perhaps if we start with you, should we be reading anything into the fact that Theresa May is going to hold off triggering Article 50 and wait until the end of the month?
I think it confirms what is starting to appear about a Prime Minister that started this idea that she's considered about everything, whereas really she's essentially quite weak in her response and unclear about where she's taking the country. She's being forced into a place on Brexit by her backbenchers. She's now having the threat of breaking up the UK because of how she's handling Brexit by Nicola Sturgeon in Scotland. It's not really her agenda, it's other people's agenda being forced on her, and that's what I think we should read into this, is that they still haven't nailed down what their plan for Britain is going forward. I
mean, in a strategic term, though, I mean, you had Nicola Sturgeon obviously stealing the government's limelight a bit with her call for a second referendum, and then you've got the Netherlands elections, which are tomorrow. Maybe at the end of the month it's just a better time in terms of when things are a little bit quieter, Theresa May can then really have the whole limelight to herself for this one, perhaps.
Well, the idea that you can plan these things in politics, if only the 90s style grid system and everyone behaved the way they should worked out. This is a game of chess where you don't know who you're playing against, and they've put us in a situation where the British Parliament won't necessarily have a say over the final deal in the way that all other 27 parliaments will. So there's other players in this debate. Britain just isn't going to say we want to leave on our own terms, in our own way, and get all the benefits, and that nobody else have a say in that conversation. There's lots of other voices.
Lord Taverne, let's just talk about the amendments, which obviously the House of Lords last night didn't take them back to the Commons to think again. Just give us your thoughts on last night's debate and last night's outcome.
Well, normally the House of Commons has the last word because it's elected and the House of Lords is not. And it should have the last word. But I think that it was wrong yesterday to say that we must obey the Commons because the Commons have turned their back on the traditions of British parliamentary democracy. I mean, the choice which Mrs May offered is an unreal choice. You haven't got a choice between stay and remain, which is what you would need at the end of the negotiations. You've got a choice between accepting what the government has negotiated, which may be a bad deal or no deal, and rejecting it, which means no deal, and that means we fall over the end of a cliff. So there was no real choice there. And the whole idea that the vote by the people on Brexit is somehow irreversible and sacrosanct. No general election is sacrosanct. The moment it's over, people start arguing against it. And why should this be sacrosanct? And especially since it's a rather dodgy, in many ways a flawed referendum in which people didn't know what they were voting for. They're voting for Brexit. It's turning out to be something quite different, which others meant. And also it was based on a series of misconceptions, lies you might call it, about immigration, that 10 million Turks were going to come tomorrow. And it is monstrous to think that we abandon our parliamentary democracy, which has served extremely well, in favour of this new doctrine that we have to obey a referendum, parliamentarians give up their own judgment and they become delegates. What's the point of parliamentarians being delegates? What's the point of having discussions in Parliament if they're going to vote as they're told?
But in terms of peers like Lord Hannay, who came on this programme to talk about why he initially supported the amendments, said on a point of principle, we sent something back to the Commons for them to think again. They sent it back to us unamended. They didn't take up on our advice. We now have to give way here.
Normally that would be absolutely right, but what he has not considered is how the Commons have abandoned their traditional approach to democracy and are no longer free agents who exercise their own judgments, but have become delegates, and that vitiates the way in which the Commons looks at things. And we in the Lords are in that sense perfectly entitled to say this is not the way in which the Commons used to proceed. We are perfectly entitled to say we are the guardians of the principles of parliamentary democracy.
Well, let's just take that hypothetically further. Yeah. How long would, in your opinion, it would have been acceptable to continue ping pong? I mean, would you have just continually hoped to have ping pong until the government finally?
I would have stuck to our guns. Of course, my colleagues didn't agree, and I'm a lone voice crying in the wilderness. I would have persisted. If we had won, I would have stuck with it and say this is a constitutional issue here, and the Salisbury Convention, which means that normally the House of Lords quite rightly yields to the elected chamber, does not apply when the House of Commons has changed its whole concept of parliamentary democracy.
I mean, Richard, in terms of what Labour's going to be doing now, obviously Jeremy Corbyn was very clear that he would be supporting the mechanisms for leaving the EU. Now that Theresa May has this authority, she will trigger Article 50. Is Labour now going to start turning the heat up in terms of scrutiny of the process of Brexit and the negotiations of Brexit?
Well, I think it's hard to say that Jeremy Corbyn has been clear in this process because we've had a number of different positions on both referendums, both in Scotland and EU related. So whether that bit of the front bench will do it, Keir Starmer is clearly going to start turning up the heat, but also so is all the mechanisms of Parliament, whether it's Hilary Benn chairing the Select Committee, whether it's the backbench Labour MPs who are really taking up some of the particular issues. So Heidi Alexander today is looking at the separate legislation that had us part of the free market and the EEA and what that means and whether that's part of an interim deal that means that businesses in the UK can keep hold of jobs and opportunities and keep us trading with our nearest neighbours. Others are going to be raising things about the customs unions and the practicalities of these things. Issues will be coming up around the country. Where Theresa May went wrong this week, fundamentally, is that she didn't give Parliament the opportunity to not only have that say at the end, but her the opportunity to say to her colleagues on the other side of the table, I can't get that through my Parliament. That would have strengthened her hand, not weakened it. OK, well, you mentioned the two referendums. We're going to talk now about the call by First Minister Sturgeon for the second referendum. And joining us, a referendum I should say, on independence for Scotland. Joining us now on via video call is Caroline Lindsay, who's the editor of Liberal Democrat Voice, who is in Scotland now. Karen, thanks for coming on the programme. It's been less than 3 years, it's been 907 days since this once in a generation vote for the Scottish people. The mood in Scotland now, post-Brexit, do you feel that there is any motive, any feeling for a second referendum this soon?
Well, every poll that has been done suggests that there isn't. But we knew, the one thing that was very clear on the 24th of June is that Nicola Sturgeon was going to gear up for a second independence referendum. It was only a matter of when. And the news reports yesterday, everyone saying it was such a surprise. It wasn't. This has been totally contrived right from the start. She built a very big tent on the 24th of June, trying to get everybody involved and trying to find a way forward that would satisfy the mandate from the Scottish voters to remain. And then immediately she started undermining it and pulling it down. And all she wanted to talk about, all her ministers wanted to talk about, was independence. And I certainly agree with her that the UK government has been intransigent, but it's not just been intransigent with her, it's been intransigent with everybody. It's been intransigent with its own parliament, which is just a travesty of democracy.
But if we just look at the Scottish people, the argument put forward by the SNP is obviously it was in their manifesto that if there was a material change in circumstances, that would warrant the justification for a second referendum. This idea of this material change in the circumstances of Scotland, does that really, in terms of what the average Scottish person who'd ask on the street, would that be really a ringing justification and a rallying call for a second referendum?
I think there's an awful lot of, my mandate's bigger than yours going on in on social media at the moment, which is not really terribly helpful. I think the other thing that Nicola was saying at the time was that there would have to be a sustained increase in people wanting an independence referendum and in support for independence. Neither of those things are happening. I mean, they're pretty much, even after Brexit, the polls are still in the margin of error of where they were in the result in 2014.
Okay, Karen Lindsay, editor of Liberal Democrat Voice, who's in Scotland, thank you very much for coming on the programme. Richard, what would be the impact of Theresa May, for example, not accepting a request from the Scottish Government for a second referendum? Because there's been reports that she's going to set conditions that the SNP must win an outright majority in Holyrood elections in 2021 before she gives any kind of consent like this. Obviously, it would push that would push it into the long grass, certainly after the next general election. Do you think that would have a real negative impact on the mood of Scotland in terms of the independence?
Well, the flat-footed nature of the Prime Minister's behaviour on all of this is what has given Nicola Sturgeon what she thinks is an upper hand and the opportunity to press her advantage. So I think the nature of how the Prime Minister does tactics so badly is that she will probably just infuriate the SNP and with them a significant section of Scottish voters. So I think they've got to really try to tread carefully on this. And what you've seen in Scotland is Ruth Davidson, who people down here have kind of fallen in love with as the nicest Tory in Britain, colluding with the SNP to bring about this situation to try and marginalise Labour. And this is actually an opportunity for Labour to lead progressive forces in Scotland in favour of unionism and making sure we argue for the single market that works best for Scotland, which of course has been part of the UK, and for an arrangement where, whether it's the EA or otherwise, where we're working with our European neighbours to trade and be able to be successful.
But of course, if you look at Nicola Sturgeon, she wants to hold this vote by spring 2019. This is while Scotland, as indeed the UK will be, still inside of the EU, and in fact the negotiations still won't be, if you were to believe what people say about EU negotiations, everything comes at the last minute. We still won't have a guaranteed structure of what a post-Brexit UK would look like. So why would she be doing that now? Because if she's going to argue there's a change in material circumstances, she doesn't really know what that change is going to be. Is that an unfair...
Look, Nicola Sturgeon does not care about any of this detail. All she cares about in politics is where a border lies between Scotland and the rest of the world. And that's what she is using a weak Prime Minister to press her advantage to make that happen. And she thinks that is the point of maximum instability, and therefore she can provide Scotland with stability and take them through to this new independence future from Scotland. But you're right, we won't know what the deal will be. We won't know where we are as a country. Scottish voters won't be voting with any certainty on the UK's relationship with the EU and what that might look like. Look, none of these things matter to Nicola Sturgeon. She saw a weak Prime Minister and she's acted.
Lord Taverne, I mean, what's your reading of this call for a second independence referendum? Do you see it as any way sort of justified by Nicola Sturgeon, or do you think there should be a second referendum, for example?
Well, I don't see that it's particularly justified in Scotland. All right, circumstances are uncertain, but as far as one has to follow the opinion polls. I don't know very much about exactly what's happening in Scotland, but the referendum in Scotland was rather different to our referendum. There were no disputed facts to the same extent as there were in Britain. With people did know what they were going to vote for. In Britain, they didn't know what the Brexit was actually going to mean. And they didn't have these misleading advertisements about on the bus that 400 and 350 million a week was going to health since withdrawn.
And that, for you, the fact that, in your opinion, there was far more truths told in that first independence referendum does not justify...
I didn't follow it that closely, so I'm not an authority in it, but my impression certainly was that there was nothing like the misleading that there was in Britain. And of course the other thing was that in Scotland, the people who are going to be most affected, namely the people who are going to, the future generations, the young ones, had a vote. And they used their vote very responsibly. Whereas in Britain, we tried in the Lords to introduce votes for 16 to 17-year-olds because it worked so well in Scotland. Oh no, that was out of the question. And the people again who were affected, namely foreigners living in England who lived there all the time, they weren't allowed to vote either. So the Scottish electorate was much more democratic than the British electorate. So it was a rather different referendum.
Okay, right, we're going to have to leave it there because it's now time for our In Focus section. Now, GCHQ has called an emergency summit with British political parties to warn them of the risks of Russian cyber attacks during the next general election. That's according to reports that came out this weekend. Kieran Martin, Chief Exec of the National Cyber Security Centre, has asked political organisations in the UK to boost their security, going as far as offering to assist organisations boost their cyber defences. From blackmail to vulnerable databases, this week I went in focus with Ewan Lawson, Senior Research Fellow at RUSI, to learn more about Britain's cyber security challenges. Ewan Lawson, in terms of the cyber defence and the cyber attacks that have been going on, particularly in the US, and indeed what the threats being posed to the UK, how do we know that it's the Russians?
So, I mean, I think one of the interesting things here is that, in a sense, what the Russians are asking us to do now is go for 100% proof. Now, of course, that's not our legal standard. Our legal standard is beyond reasonable doubt. So what you've seen, particularly over Christmas, with the American intelligence agencies coming out and talking and pointing the finger very firmly at Russia, is an analysis based on not just the software and the malware being used, but also the broader patterns of activity and how that relates to how the intelligence agencies perceive Russia as acting.
So in terms of how we're detecting and following these people who are launching attacks on institutions in the US and the UK and all over the world, how are we able to trace that back to Russia in particular?
So some of that's about forensics. So that's about the analysis of the malware, when it's discovered, all the techniques used, and sometimes it can actually be traced back to the infrastructure on which the initial attack, if you like, is hosted from, where it begins from, and through that and through patterns of activity. And that infrastructure may not necessarily be in Russia, but it is linked to previous activity which, for other reasons, other sources of intelligence, human intelligence, other forms of data intelligence, has been positively linked to Russian actors.
I mean, in terms of the threat which GCHQ say poses to political institutions in the UK, obviously when we go out to vote we use a pen and paper to cast our ballot, and that is a very secure form of voting. So what is the nature of the threat that GCHQ feel the political institutions in the UK are really under threat from?
So I guess back in the Cold War we'd have called it subversion. So it's less about direct interference in the mechanics of the election and more about undermining confidence in the process and potentially undermining the confidence in particular candidates. So certainly in the States, rather than perhaps a plan to get Donald Trump into power, perhaps if there was an aspiration at all, it was to have a weakened Hillary Clinton in power, a much more predictable politician, but one perhaps undermined by the release of stories and evidence about bad behaviours on her part.
And is that why party databases, for example, are something which are particularly vulnerable?
So I think it's about looking at any evidence you can gain, which can then be used to undermine the credibility of that party or its individuals. So those databases, particularly if they're around donors, can reveal sources of funding that perhaps parties are uncomfortable about coming out in public.
Let's look at reports which have come out this month, which is that at least a dozen groups have been hit with, a dozen organisations rather in the US have been hit with blackmail threats about stuff which has been accessed online, which they're now threatening to release. The names which are coming up are Cozy Bear and Fancy Bear and groups like that. Could you tell us anything about these groups?
So these are just names really for a couple of Russian-based actors. The complex in Russia is interesting, and the evidence for this is again not in that 100% certain area, but probably more in the beyond reasonable doubt. That what's happening is Russian state agencies, particularly the GRU, Russian military intelligence, the SVR, FSB, Russian domestic and overseas intelligence agencies, are using groups that they have suborned sometimes by threatening them with jail and then saying, come and work for us. There's been some more reporting this week about a group called Sholty Bolty, which is actually Humpty Dumpty in Russian, where they have come out and said, we were threatened, we were a hacktivist group, we were threatened with prosecution, but then told, if you work for us.
So does that mean that the Russian state has control of these groups? So is it literally a transactional basis sometimes that the state almost hires these groups to do some work for them, and then what they do after that with the information perhaps they obtain is nothing to do with the Russian state, they would claim.
So I think that's one of the interesting dimensions to this. I mean, there's been some comparisons with sort of 16th century, 17th century privateering. So the idea that what the state does is says to these groups, here's some capabilities, some facilities, perhaps some cash. Go out and cause a bit of mayhem in the West. Fairly broad set of riding instructions, nothing very detailed. And what you've found at the as the post-election period comes up is these organisations have been left with some data, and the Russian state says, well, we have no use for it, do with it as you wish, and they're hence using it, as you say, for potential blackmail efforts.
Let's just look at what GCHQ have said they will offer support to political organisations, political parties in the upcoming election. What does that actually mean? What kind of support would GCHQ be looking to give these organisations?
So, I mean, I think GCHQ and perhaps more specifically now the National Cybersecurity Centre is very much an outward-facing organisation, and whereas in the past GCHQ was much more inward-looking, what they're looking to do now is to secure as much of Britain's critical infrastructure as it can, including the political parties, through a process of engagement. So they'll be able to say to the specialists within organisations, here's some things to look for, whether those are signatures of particular bits of malware, particular signs of activity, other technical aspects. Because, of course, the political parties quite often, I suspect, don't have the sort of technical cybersecurity support that a big multinational would have.
So do GCHQ at the moment have monitoring softwares, monitoring infrastructure within key infrastructures of the UK government and important?
Well, certainly within UK government, the GCHQ provides that technical support to UK government. Into commercial organisations, no, not so much. That would have to be by agreement. But they have the capability to identify, perhaps, say, they call it beaconing, which is a kind of outgoing message from a piece of malware that it's logged in a particular institution, and they can go to that institution and say, look, we're picking up that you may have a problem.
In terms of where Britain stands in amongst the other countries in terms of cyber defence and cyber security, obviously we hear reports of the amount of money put in by the Chinese, by the US, by the Russians to do with their cyber defence infrastructure. Where does Britain stand? What are we considered high up there in the league tables, or are we struggling?
I think so. I mean, Britain aspires, as stated in the National Cybersecurity Strategy, to be a world leader, and I think it would be very easy to overly criticise the UK. So, if you look at it from kind of first principles, the UK, is a target, absolutely is a target, and it has quite a dependence on infrastructure, on information technology infrastructure, which means there's quite a big, what they call an attack surface that could be exploited. Against that, I think the UK is making some reasonable steps of progress towards making itself more secure. It's got this policy now of active cyber defence, which is really about trying to stop threats before they get inside the internet in the UK, before they get inside the UK bit of a network. So at those relatively few access points that the internet has into the UK. I guess my only concern would be, if you look at it across the broader sense of security, whilst there's a substantial amount of money being spent on the National Cybersecurity Programme, it's still something like 1/150th of what we're spending on conventional defence material.
But even those countries such as the US, a report came out, am I right, last week by the Department of Defense criticising, or rather highlighting vulnerabilities in the US cyber defense. And the US obviously we'd consider to be, something which they'd really take a priority on.
So I mean, the US, I think it's fair to say, have been much more proactive in this game for much longer. But I make no bones about it. I was surprised by the tone of this Department of Defense report last week, which talked about the ability of the major state actors, specifically naming China and Russia, as effectively being able to hold key bits of the national infrastructure of the US to ransom for a period looking out to 10 years before they believe that they are able to actively defend against it. But the whole point of that report is not just to be critical, it's actually to recommend some other things they need to be doing.
Ewan Lawson, Senior Research Fellow for RUSI, thank you very much for coming on the programme.
Pleasure.
Now, the Netherlands goes to the polls tomorrow to decide who will be its next Prime Minister. Much of the media surrounding the election is focused on a battle between Geert Wilders, leader of the Party for Freedom, known as the PVV, and incumbent Prime Minister Mark Rutte, leader of the People's Party for Freedom and Democracy. Joining us now to talk through the election is Dina Pardijs from the European Council on Foreign Relations. Dina, you've written a commentary talking about Wilders' 10-year plan and saying that he's playing a long game in these elections. Just tell us a little bit more about this long game.
Yes, my theory is that he is not expecting or even planning to get into government this year, and he's working on slowly growing his support over the coming election cycles until he can actually govern practically by himself. So even though the media, I saw it a lot here in the UK, is really focusing on the fight between him and the Conservatives and will this be a populist takeover, in reality, because of how the Dutch system works, this is quite unlikely, and he's likely to go back into populism, but with maybe a stronger support than previous years.
I mean, you mentioned it there. In the Netherlands, it's a system of direct representation. It's very unlikely that Wilders would have any chance of getting into power, becoming Prime Minister of the Netherlands. I'm right in thinking that, aren't I?
Yes, and that's because the votes, even when he was leading in the polls, which is also a while ago, he would only have gotten 20% of the votes. So there's about 6-7 larger parties over which the vote is divided. So that's definitely not enough for a majority. It's normal to have a 2-3 party coalition. This year the vote is very divided. So it's looking at maybe 4, even 5 parties in a coalition, and all other parties have already stated they would not work with Geert Wilders. So that leaves him in opposition.
I mean, you're talking about Mr. Wilders' policies. He's pledged to take the Netherlands out of the EU, close all mosques and ban the Quran. For us in the UK, perhaps, well, some people in the UK might consider the Netherlands to be a very progressive, forward-looking country, which perhaps that would conflict with. How is his messages and his policies getting so much, or seemingly getting so much traction in the Netherlands? What's happened?
I think it's not only those specific points. For example, on taking the Netherlands out of the EU, it hasn't really been that big an issue in this cycle. It's also the way he presents himself as sort of anti-establishment. He very much approaches the campaign differently. He doesn't have a big party program with plans and calculations. He just has an A4 with bullet points of what he wants to do. He doesn't go to the media, but instead he tweets a lot. So maybe, whereas I think there's support for part of his points, but also just the idea that he will shake things up and he will be a change from mainstream politicians.
But you don't see him as, you listen to those kind of points you've made, you know, perhaps limited policies, but in particular the way he's communicating his message using unconventional platforms such as social media rather than the actual traditional media outlets. That would be a very Trump-like strategy to follow. But do you see him replicating much of Trump's election success?
Yeah, well, I don't think he'll have the same kind of success as I mentioned, and even it's still possible that he'll be the biggest party, but not the same kind of effect in the end on governing. He is definitely copying some of the methods, and he's also expressed his support for Trump in the past. He went to the Republican convention, he's tweeting in English a lot, he's writing for the Breitbart website. So he definitely sees himself as sort of next in that line of populists or sort of change makers.
And in terms of what the PVV are doing, if they're playing this long game, they're waiting to slowly build up their support. And I think in your article you suggest a serious terrorist attack on Dutch soil, economic crisis, could tilt public opinion further towards the PVV. And then, of course, we've had what's happened this week in terms of what's happened with Turkey and the protests which have happened there. I think it's been reported that protests held on Sunday outside the Dutch consulate in Istanbul, the Netherlands flag was replaced with a Turkish one, for example. Is something like that the type of event which could see a surge in support for a party like PVV this election?
Something like that, yes. I think what Wilders needs is images on the news of violence caused by migrants and Muslim migrants especially, and he needs a weak government not really acting. And he got sort of half of that. So there were images on the news of these protests and Turkish people with a double nationality complaining about the Netherlands, which fits his image of migrants that are causing trouble. But on the other hand, it was also an opportunity for the Prime Minister to act very strongly. They were very firm with Turkey, maybe even overreacted a bit. And also all other parties came out in support of the government, even Geert Wilders said, well, it's only because of me that the government did this, but this is the policy they should have taken. So he only got sort of half of the success there. In the end, he was just one of the people supporting the government. The Prime Minister got to stop campaigning and be a strong leader. So I don't think this will really tip the balance for him.
Lord Taverne,
Yeah.
what's your reading of the Netherlands election, if you're having? What do you see as happening this
Well, I listen
tomorrow?
to experts like Caroline, but it does seem to me quite clear that he hasn't got a cat's chance in hell of being in government, because all the other parties have said there. And with this, Holland has got this strange system of so many parties that you can be the most popular party with 20% of the vote. I mean, that's a bit odd, but the phenomenon is a very worrying one. I mean, the Brexit was greeted with enormous enthusiasm by people like Geert Wilders and the ghastly Orban in Hungary and all the other sort of protectionist and I would say rather anti-democratic forces, the protectionist forces, and Trump, of course. And there is always this fear that this is something which is worldwide. I mean, Brexit was followed by Trump. Nobody gave Trump a chance. Everyone thought initially that Brexit wouldn't be the result of the election. So Trump may do a bit better. Marine Le Pen, how well is she going to do? It's all part of the same phenomenon. And it is deeply worrying for someone who is concerned about the welfare of Europe, as I am. I'm a fervent pro-European.
I mean, Richard, is that something you'd buy into, this idea of there is a growing trend worldwide towards a more populist form of politics?
There clearly is, but what there seems to be as a reaction to it is that a liberal establishment is going to gang up against it and kind of cut it out. And at some point, we've got to actually take on the arguments. The glib won't work in a complex world that's interconnected. There is no scenario in which migration goes down in the world. So promising things that people might want to hear, but you cannot deliver, will not work and will only make far-right parties worse. We've got to take on these arguments, doorstep to doorstep, community to community. And globalisation in many ways has been a positive thing, but for those where it hasn't, we can have a conversation, we can have interventions, we need skills, we need better opportunities than manufacturing, and we can provide better for our communities and not leave people behind.
We're going to have to leave there because we're running out of time, but thank you, Dina, Richard, and of course Lord Taverne for coming on the programme this week. Now, we're out of time this week, but don't forget you can find videos, comment and much more on our Facebook page and on Twitter @TipTVPolitics. Join me again next week for all the latest in the week's politics. Until then, from me, Rob Double, have a great week. Goodbye.
Thank you.